Our next speaker needs no introduction, but I will give a brief one anyway. Olaoluwa. One of the things we've spoken about today is there's different post-quantum signature schemes. They rely on different mathematical assumptions. A lot of things that I'm not qualified to talk about, which is why we have Olaoluwa here to talk about some of that.
Hello. Hey. All right. So as mentioned, so I'm interested in sort of more of the concrete, things, and sort of I think there's definitely a big philosophical algorithm of sort of what happens, how do we coordinate. I'm more interested in sort of what are the schemes, how can we do it on Bitcoin, what constraints are we worried about, and in particular, exactly what parameters can we have that maybe tune something a little more towards Bitcoin, right? So I'm going to focus purely on hash-based signatures here, and I'll give you a little sort of overview. And so I think it's relevant to sort of give more motivation of why hash-based itself, right? So obviously, as we know, ECC and RSA, they're going to be broken by this stuff, and scaling it up doesn't necessarily seem feasible. There are lattice-based schemes that we talked about a little bit earlier. I mean, so I would say the advantage of these schemes are they have more structure, for example, so you can probably do things similar to what we do in Bitcoin around key aggregation, these different type of proofs and things like that as well too. But they have newer assumptions basically, and also there's also some implementation of pitfalls as far as properly sampling the distribution. You basically need to restart a signature sometimes if it actually doesn't work with a certain probability, and I think it's a bit more hairy than some of the hash-based schemes. There's also a code base as well. Codes base have very, very large public keys. To my knowledge, they actually haven't been standardized by NIST as well too, right? So I think hash-based is basically the way to go, right? And the main thing is that if you think about it, every single signature scheme has a hash function in it already at some point, basically, right? So you're not necessarily adding any new assumptions to it itself, right? And also, Bitcoin already uses hash functions everywhere. We have the Merkle trees, we have the SIG hash flags, we have the TXIDs, we have all that stuff as well too, right? And if you look at the security proofs, they're all reduced down to basically some property of hash functions, right? Either maybe that's collision resistance, second preimage resistance, and so forth, right? So these are things that we already know, fairly well. And also, one thing is after the NIST SHA-3 competition, I think cryptologists say basically have a very, very good idea of how security of hash functions actually functions basically in order to actually reason about these things effectively. The signing and also verification is fairly fast because once again it's just hash functions. There's no asymmetric operations or as far as cryptography itself. And most laptops, phones also have SHA-NI basically, sort of an optimized hardware accelerated version of SHA opcodes basically. And also there's different things you can do as far as vectorization to hash a bunch of values all together, right? And some of these hash-based schemes are very much optimized for hash functions in terms of doing things like reducing the compression function instances. Maybe that means some pattern with SHA-2 and SHA-3 is a little bit different as well too. And one big thing of Sphinx Plus is actually it's fully stateless, right? So one thing with some of the other hash-based schemes, maybe it's a one-time use. Basically, you need to maybe remember exactly which keys you used in the past. The way Sphinx works, it's a massive tree as we get into a little bit, and the idea is that basically you can just keep using these signatures because the tree is so massive you'll never run into a collision, right? That's sort of intuition about it, right? So as I was saying before, I think it's suitable for Bitcoin because we have Merkle trees everywhere. We have SHA-2. It actually also uses SHA-5 in some of the constructions, just because sometimes you basically need a slightly larger output size, but not too different basically. And the big thing here is there's not necessarily any entirely new cryptographic primitives introduced, right? You are constructing sort of by via composition, sort of what we already know and use today, in Bitcoin itself. But there's no new scheme around maybe a hardness problem that doesn't reduce down to something that we already know today with as far as hash functions, right? And so I'll give you a little intuition on the way that things work. So there's sort of a few time and a one-time signature scheme, right? One-time signature schemes, or maybe you've heard of something like line 4 signatures, basically, where you sort of have these pair of hashes, you hash it up, and you basically reveal, a hash based on the bit itself, right? That's a one-time signature scheme, right? So the way that Sphinx works is basically it takes a few time signature scheme, something that you can use a few times and sort of have degraded security. It signs a message with that basically. Then it has a massive tree of one-time signature scheme public keys, basically, right? And then as you go up the tree, you basically sign the one-time key public key with the root of the lower layer, basically, and you keep bubbling up from there itself, right? And one interesting thing about it, I'll get into it a little bit later, is that it actually natively supports sort of public key recovery as we know in Bitcoin, right? Because the validation algorithm is basically you have these Merkle proofs basically that are revealed, and you're checking that the hash of that root thing basically matches the public key already, right? So you can save a little bit of space, but the public keys are actually fairly small. They can be 32 or 64 bytes, similar to what we know today with elliptic curve cryptography, right? And here's sort of a scheme of it, right? It's hey, yo, dog, I heard you like Merkle trees, so we put a Merkle tree in your Merkle tree so you can Merkle while you Merkle, right? And so this is the way it works right here. So you start at the very bottom, right? So you sign the message with a for scheme, right? And basically the way this works is that everything is somewhat deterministic. You have a seed, and from that seed you can basically derive all of these various indexes, right? And you can basically view this tree as a way you can basically address it. You're sort of viewing the Merkle tree or the binary tree itself as sort of an array. You can basically have indexes into that array that represent the actual tree. It works. That's the way it goes. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but like there's a few parameters that once again control sort of like the signature speed and also the size of the signature itself. And I think this is an interesting thing around sort of like picking some of these parameters with the way they work with Bitcoin, right? One other thing is that like so with this scheme, like typically the NIST scheme, like it's good up to like 2 to the 64 signatures, which is like a massive amount of signatures basically, right? And in practice, you don't necessarily need that many signatures. So like once again, like just for use, so we say maybe someone's reusing something thousands of times basically. The parameters we can say, okay, well you can use it 20 million times or 1 million times, which is actually pretty good, right? And probably the only scheme that we have today that's widely used that like generates a ton of signatures with the exact same key is Lightning channels, right? Maybe very, very old Lightning channels, maybe they sign with the same key millions of times, but for the most part, like a normal user like is going to sign maybe 10, 20, 30, maybe an exchange, millions of times, but not necessarily billions, trillions, because 2 to the 64 is a very, very large number, right? And then so you start with the message basically, you sign that with the for scheme at the very bottom, and then you're basically going to go up progressively, and then sign the root of the the signature of the for scheme. We'll get into what that is later with a one-time signature scheme basically, right? And then that has another layer, which is a series of one-time signature public keys, right? You make a tree from that itself, and then you sign the root of that. Right? So basically, the way a signature works, you basically start at the bottom to verify it. You verify the signature for this one, and then you're just doing Merkle tree inclusion proofs all the way up, along with one-time signature text, until you get to the root. After you get to the root, then you sign it, right? And this is going to come in a little bit important because we can play with these parameters. For example, D, the total number of Merkle trees; H, the height of the Merkle tree; W, the winter width parameter, which basically is sort of like the length of the hash change versus how many actually hashes you have, and then things with the fors as well too. And so, let's go into winter nits. This is one of those things where it's like I've said it a bunch of times in my head, and I realized I was saying it wrong. So it's winter nits. I always said winter wits for many, many years until someone said it out loud. Like I was like, okay, winter nits signatures, right? So basically, the way this works, you have like a series of secret key values you generate randomly, right? And so what you do, you basically have a message, and that message basically tells you which secret key values you're going to hash like n number of times, right? So the public key just starts with the secret key values. Sorry, the secret key is just the values. The public key basically hashes all of those n times. People have seen things like atomic encryption, basically, where typically they have something where you hash n times. There's different forms of some sort of like proof of space and time kind of thing, which typically involves some sort of like trade-off for that. This is effectively that, right? So the public key is then like you basically take all of these these end hash chains and then make a single hash from that using tweakable hash digest. And here's a great diagram by Conduition from Twitter, maybe just in his blog post, of sort of like how this works, right? So at the bottom you have like your secret values. You then hash those n times, and then based on the message, there's like a checksum and some other details as well. You basically know how many times to hash any of these like secret links, right? So basically the proof is basically like a hash link list, right? And that's sort of like the way the one-time signature scheme works. Then we have fors, which is called fors of random subsets, right? So there's two parameters that's associated with this, k and a. So k is the number of trees, basically. Once again, it's all just Merkle trees, and then a is basically the height of each Merkle tree. And then similar to the one-time signature scheme, watts, you basically take some sort of like digest, and then from that figure out exactly number one which trees to reveal, basically, because once again you reveal from a subset of trees, and also the leaf in each tree to reveal. And here's another great diagram by Conduition that basically shows how this works. So at the bottom, once again, you have these secret values. You hash those secret values. There's these, n or k trees, basically. The public key is the hash of all the actual trees. So you basically have the message digest and the indexes, and you're going to pick, okay, I'm going to reveal this leaf, and then that, and self. And once again, everyone can just validate it works, because validating a signature is correct means that, okay, well, these Merkle tree inclusion proofs give me the exact same public key, and that's the way the for scheme works. And then this is the next thing. So it's cool because Sphinx, like, initially it seems very like unwieldy, but like once you understand each of the individual schemes, you're basically just composing those schemes into one final signature scheme, right? And the final one is the XMSS, which is basically sort of an extended Merkle signature scheme, which is actually a super old signature scheme, made by Ralph Merkle back in the day. And then people sort of like improved it a bunch, right? So this is the portion of the hybrid tree, right? So what we do here, we have, once again, a bunch of one-time signature schemes. We make a Merkle tree from that itself, and then signing this thing is basically revealing one of those leaves with a one-time signature scheme as well. And I say what's plus here because if you get into it, there's like different versions of watts. Some of them basically, ended up modifying the checksum, adding another XOR value. The way the Sphinx paper did it, they basically have something they call like a tweakable hash function that sort of like takes place of the XOR and make things a little bit smaller, and they just hash all the keys at the very end, right? And then we have the hybrid tree, right? So ideally, you can go back in the slides later. I'll publish them. Now you can basically understand exactly how this works, right? It's interesting because like the public key is generated, or rather like all this is fairly deterministic, right? So there's like a secret private key, and then from that you're able to generate any of the preimages as far as like the watts, the fors, whatever else. And then in order to generate this, the public key, you basically just generate only the top layer of the hybrid tree, and then hash that, and that's your public key that you can put out there basically. And I was saying, so like this multi-layer design is actually some of the improvements. There's actually something called Sphinx. This is Sphinx plus, and there was some prior versions of that. And this is actually what makes things feasible and effectively stateless, right? Like it's stateless in that the number is so big that the collision probability that you actually get the exact same, instance basically for a different message, and is fairly low basically. So that's like the hypertree structure, and hopefully now you guys know how hypertrees work. But yeah, so this is I mentioned a little earlier about signing and verification. So signing basically starts at the bottom. You basically do the forest pair. You go all the way up. You're basically signing every single layer of the hypertree root, which is a Watts pair. You have the final signature. The verification basically works a similar way. You basically have this massive proof as a serialized proof. You start at the bottom. You basically verify matches the public key, and the public key doesn't necessarily need to be in the script. Maybe it was in the output script, as we'll talk about later. And you basically just verify that everything hashes, and it's all good. And so this is probably one of the main things that I was monitoring the NIST PQ forum basically, and there's this paper that I think I'd read a while back, but they reached out to individuals because, as you see a little bit later, some of the parameters that NIST recommended resulted in fairly large signatures that were somewhat slow to validate basically, right? And that's because they were going for the ultimate level of 2 to 64 signatures, right? But in practice, people don't necessarily need to generate that many signatures. I definitely encourage people to check out both the forum push and also the paper itself because, for example, there was a bunch of people from maybe their rent certificate authorities. They're okay, well, even if we have 100 concurrent signers and we're signing one message every second or whatever else, it's going to take us a million years to actually go to that parameter, right? So it's cool because a bunch of people from the hardware industry, maybe they're signing some hardware key, maybe they're doing some validation, the certificate industry, whatever else. They kind of okay, well, we don't necessarily need those super duper conservative parameters. Maybe some things will still use that, but we can once again play with these parameters in order to do things that I mentioned before. Hashes are fast. There's no sort of asymmetric operations, and you can do a bunch of hashes a second even on your laptop itself. Next slide. So these are the official NIST parameter sets, right? So it's divided into one. There's sort of SHA-2 versus SHA-3 or shake basically, and also they divided into the number of the amount of security bits you get. The bits of security 128, 192, and 256, right? And as you see, even the smallest one is around 7, 8 kilobytes, which is fairly large basically, right? And the nice thing for all of this is either way the public key size and the secret key size are fairly small. For example, if you look at something like the code base, you have hundreds of kilobytes of public key size. This is pretty nice because once again, you can just put this thing, and also the public key is already a hash, right? So you don't need to also do another hash, which is some page script hash that some of us know are fairly well, right? So this is what they went at. They're saying, okay, well, these are the super conservative parameters. These are fairly large. For example, a 50 kilobyte key, and people are thinking about things like TLS. Maybe it's something that attests to a BIOS or some other bootloader or something like that. They want these things to be fairly small. And also, once you get into the hardware environment, imagine your hardware wallet generating a 50 kilobyte signature, right? That's a lot, and typically they're fairly limited in terms of memory and what they're doing as well. So can we get this smaller? And the answer is yes. So this is a super interesting paper because it looks at a few things, right? So one thing, because we have this massive hypertree, you're generating a lot of hashes, right? And so they were saying, okay, well, what if we set a budget of 100,000 hashes, 1 million hashes, 10 million hashes, 100 million hashes, 600 million hashes, right? It sounds like a lot, but with SHA-NI, you can generate hashes, just in terms of nanoseconds, basically. You can also even use vectorized instructions, basically pipeline this stuff and get it down pretty slow, right? So using some of these parameters, we can actually get signatures down to around 3 kilobytes, right? So you can do this lower as well. So for example, this is looking at the number of allowed signatures of 2 to the 20, which is roughly a million or so. You can go smaller than that if you actually wanted to. If you go even smaller, you can get this down to 1 or 2 kilobytes, right? And maybe you'd go smaller. Maybe you wouldn't use that for Lightning channel. Maybe you'd use that for a normal spending wallet that doesn't necessarily do very, very high throughput, right? And so the signing cost is interesting there because number of hashes. They typically do number of hashes because they're looking at the sort of asymptotics in this case, and it depends on your implementation, right? The hardware, exactly what you're doing, and your optimizations, and so forth, right? And one interesting parameter they have here is what they call overuse safety, right? So overuse safety is the number of signatures that you can safely generate beyond the number of allowed signatures, and then degrade to a lower, number of bits of security, right? So I think it was 128 goes to 112 bits of security. Maybe I think it was 256 goes to 192, and then so forth, right? So this is interesting because you can play with these parameters, and the overuse safety is sort of your budget of messing up, right? For whatever reason, if the user messes up and they have a while loop running, or they have some other scheme, or there's some Oracle attack in some protocol or something like that, this is what you can tune, right? And the main thing is that as you sort of increase overuse safety, you end up generating more hashes, and as you'll see later, the hashes based on the height of the hypertree. Oh, good.
Would that be for the same? Thank you. Would that be for the same public key?
Yeah.
So actual address reuse of more than 205 times 1 billion.
Yes.
And only then security goes down on the same
Yes. And it
script.
doesn't break immediately. Basically, the way the modeling, it starts to degrade over time. And if you look at the paper, there's a bunch of cool graphs around sort of like as you do more and more hashes, how much what your security level degradation actually is. So it's nice because it's not like something like on short signatures where if you reuse the again, boom, you're hosed basically. This is sort of something that actually degrades over time. And the main thing you can look at is also verification. So you can see like the number of hashes to sign is much larger than verification because whenever you're signing, you're actually generating all of these intermediate trees depending on the hypertree construction, and also you're doing more hashes. If you look at something like Winterwitz, maybe you're going to hash it halfway, and then they do it the other way, or 3/4, and then so forth, basically. And you can get that down as well. And this is still like fairly fast because 450 hashes are still super fast. If you look at things like cryptography, even with all the optimizations, you're just generating a hash. And like in order to generate, like let's say you're making a sig hash of like a fairly large Bitcoin transaction, you may generate hundreds of hashes in the process, right? So it's not that different in that case. And then so this is important because this is about the sort of like the level of parameters and like what you can do for each parameter to tweak exactly the size and the how long it takes to generate a signature itself, right? So first you have H and D. So H is the total hypertree size, right? And then D is the number of layers in each hypertree. So the thing is, if you increase D, you have to also generate more Winterwitz one-time signatures, or the WAS signatures basically, which increases the size of it, right? But if you lower D, that means you need to generate the entire hypertree potentially all at once, which increases the signing cost and actually increases the number of hashes as well. Similarly, we have K and A for fours, right? So K is the number of trees, and then A is the height of each tree. So once again, if you reduce the number of trees, but increase the height of the tree because you're still going for that same level of security, you may have bigger signatures. And then finally, W is the Watts parameter, which basically states sort of like how large the word size is, basically, which determines how many hashes you actually have to generate and the number of hashes as well. So you can play with all of these, and they actually have like a really cool code base, basically, lets you plug in these parameters and do some simulations on them, and that's how they arrived at the ones that they ended up putting in the paper. And these are just some of the ones that I chose. So for example, they also go to 2 to the 30 and 2 to the 40 allowed signatures. They also, and this is level 1 security, which is 128-bit. There's also level 3 security, which is 256-bit as well. I think the smallest one for that was like 7 or 6K, so I ended up leaving it off. But like, there's actually some liberty with these parameters here. And then so that gets me into okay, what about Bitcoin? Like, how does it actually work on Bitcoin, right? So I started looking to this stuff. I have some code that's not fully ready yet, but hopefully I publish it in the next few weeks. So let's say we have like a hypothetical, op, SLH, DSH, checksig. We can have a better name, Sphinx check or something like that itself. So one initial, issue is that Tapscript actually has a 520 byte stack limit, element limit for each element of the stack, basically, right? So for example, this is nice because this means something like a opcat can't just like explode the size because you actually have that restriction there, basically. So maybe there needs to be some difference there. For example, maybe we can actually put the signature in the annex itself, which isn't necessarily subject to any of those issues. And maybe the check operation actually reads the signature from the annex and then validates like that. That's one example. As I was mentioned, like the small signatures, it can be around 3 kilobytes. One of the things that you also need to figure out some sort of like analog with SIGOP cost, right? So people that don't know with the way Tapscript works, every single signature is basically 50 cost, right? And there's a total limit for within the block itself, right? Once you go below that, then you basically have an issue as far as SIGOP cost. So this means, like, for example, there's only so many signatures you can have for multisig and then so forth, but obviously things like MUSIG2 help with that. So one question is, okay, well, we're generating a lot of hashes, right? As you see here, like potentially, millions of hashes, but like once again, that's just signing. Verification isn't too bad. So I haven't, run this yet, but it seems similar to like if you have some like massive transaction, how many hashes are you generating if it has like 1,000 inputs or 10,000 inputs or so forth, right? So the question is like, do we actually need another I think I jumped ahead a little bit. Yeah, do we actually need another like costing mechanism, or is the weight of the block already enough? Maybe it's not, because once again, these signatures will still be 3 kilobytes or so, right? So you're not necessarily going to like DOS someone by making them do a bunch of stuff because they're just hashing, and it's a little bit cheaper than signatures, and you can also do some of this stuff in parallel as well. And then so I was thinking, okay, like, let's say you wanted to go away from sort of like the current Tapscript version. I know people have different ideas. So, one idea basically you would have like your normal script root, basically, like let's call this output hash itself. But then you would also have the key spend key hash along with that, right? Which still lets you do sort of like a smaller reveal for the key spend case, and then still have the script path as well, right? So it's slightly different because the way Tapscript works, above, we're actually leveraging some of the properties of the structure from lithic cryptography to let you basically do this like tweaked output key and then reveal it and so forth. But it's okay, well, maybe we're not necessarily going to have that like EC aspect of itself, but we can still sort of replicate the cheap path for key spend and then the expensive path for actually doing the hashes there. You can get into it. Maybe you can increase size of the hashes because, for example, I think it's like you have like an n/3 reduction on the hash size. So 256 would need to be 384 and then so forth. But maybe that's not really an issue because you still have pre-image resistance, second pre-image, and so forth in that itself. So one other thing, along with this is that because now we're basically just in hash land. Hashes don't have any structure, which is also nice because there's no structure, there's not as much room for sort of more clever ideas around if I manipulate this algorithm, I can do this and blah blah blah, which is typically how some of these speedups work or in terms of breakages. So you can't actually do public key derivation the way you can do with BIP32, right? Because BIP32 it exploits all of these different properties of I have the public key, I can derive a public key that they can have the private key to without them knowing, and there's some different things about that. So it seems like you would actually lose that going in the hash-based direction itself. You can still maintain deterministic, seed generation basically, but you just can't have that public derivation itself, right? So this may change the way some wallets work basically because now they just need the key itself. Once again, it's nice because the key is just 32 bytes. It's not massive like some of these other schemes itself. And watch-only wallets would need to be a little bit different as well. But once again, you could give them once again another Merkle tree, a Merkle tree of all of your public keys basically generated from this itself. You can give them proofs basically to authenticate those. So that's one thing investigating is something that is a little bit different today. And this is a very high-level Python example of how you do something like this. You get maybe a derivation path, have some sort of identifier, because I mentioned a little bit earlier there's different parameter sets, and those parameter sets determine exactly the structure of the tree, run that through SHA-512, and then basically from there you basically run the normal the Sphinx plus a key derivation, which is about deriving this key, and then boom, you can do that itself, right? So so you can still have sort of a seed. Maybe you would increase some of the parameters on the seed itself. You can still generate address deterministically from that seed. Just someone can't take a public key for you and generate more public keys because that's a one-way hash function basically. And still, there's no known, to my knowledge, pre-image attack on hash functions today, even though maybe some of them have collisions that are somewhat cheap. One thing obviously is blocks, right? So right now signatures are very small. They're 64 bytes or so, and so increasing the signature size to 3 kilobytes or so does cut down on block space itself, right? So even with optimized parameters, there will be sort of a reduction in sort of the effective throughput effectively. And I think maybe someone will talk about this a little bit later, but it's feasible that you can actually use things like Starks to basically do aggregation of several of these signatures into one single basically proof, right? So maybe you take 1 million of these proofs would be much larger. You can give 100 kilobyte Stark proof and then use that instead. Right? Obviously, that's needs to be developed, but it's interesting as well because there's something called Picnic, which is one of the NIST NIST finalists, basically, and it was actually a Stark-based signature scheme. It basically just worked by sort of having running a PRF, a secret through a PRF, and then doing a Stark proof, this thing MPC in the head, along with it, that showed basically that this thing was generated in a valid manner. So it seems like there can be some friendliness there. One other thing as well is for example, for Starks, there's certain hash functions that are sort of more quote unquote Stark friendly because they have a structure that lends better to the way they define sort of the what's effectively a circuit basically. So maybe someone would look into something like that itself to actually have it be a little more friendly. These are just sort of ideas in the parameter space that may make sense in the future. But yeah, so some future work. I started dabbling on stuff because I feel like there's a lot of conversation around sort of the what do we do in the philosophy or whatever else. This is sort of a more I think defined problem basically, and we just need some code. And once there's code out there, people can actually start experimenting with this stuff. Look at walls, things like that. So it feels like maybe there's a few BIPs here. I have the code. I don't have the BIPs yet. But so number one, sort of a BIP for this NIST-compatible Sphinx plus scheme basically. It may have different parameters. I think that'd be a question for discussion with the community. Okay, do we just have one parameter set, or do we have one for the average case and one for the off-chain multi-party computation case basically? That's one question as well. You need something to basically allow people to once again generate many addresses from a single seed. And one other thing I mentioned a little bit earlier is that that misuse overload factor basically that was for a single address, right? So you can still sign with a single address 1 million times more than you're supposed to, and you're okay, right? But then you can still generate multiple addresses from that. And then I know there's BIP360 as well. Maybe something around sort of do we have a slightly different top-level output key construction basically that may allow you to reveal this stuff, but then also go on the other end. And I have some code that maybe I'll release in the next few weeks or so. Basically, PQ BTCD, Implicit and I work on basically implement some of this stuff as a prototype, just to show exactly what we're looking at. What do we need to do as far as the stack size? How does this derivation scheme work? How slow is sliding, verification, and so forth. And one interesting thing would be also as well is that if I was going to pack a block full of this stuff, what's the impact on things like block verification speed and validation costs, for the network and so forth. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Can I ask one more? When you go to the second last Sphinx parameter slide, you said you
this one.
This one, yeah. You can do billions or millions of signatures. We don't want address reuse for privacy reasons. So if we tune that down to thousands of signatures before the security drops, could we get the SIG size down significantly?
Yeah, you can.
Do you have a gut feeling how far?
Yeah. I mean, so for example, like in the paper, they have a 2 to the 10. Basically, I didn't include that just because like it's a fairly small number compared to this itself. But so that's why maybe there's sort of like a a small and a big parameter set. Small is basically okay. Like I know I'm probably not going to generate like more than 100,000 signatures, more than a million signatures. Basically, that's more reasonable. And then you have something for more reuse. But I think you can get this down to like 2 kilobytes or so. I would need to actually look at some of the parameters around that. And once again, like even once you have the signature side, you can play around with the overuse safety, which maybe trades off for increased signing speed. Increased signing speed versus the actual size. And if you check out the paper, there is like some code. They published some C code basically where you can plug in these numbers and spit out a parameter set. And there's some graphs, things like that. The paper is really dope.
I have one question about. So I understand that the allowed signatures, you turn that knob down, you'll get a slightly smaller. But one big part about this is like it's stateless, right? So the idea is I don't have to keep track of which parts of the bottom I used before. But it seems like in the Bitcoin use case, you have a pretty hard limit on how many stateless signatures you could ever make because that's how much is in a block. Like whenever you're making a signature, you can look at previous blocks. I mean, that's a different assumption. Maybe you can in a hardware thing. But you could say like, so you'd know more about this. Is there a way to like have allowed signatures sort of decoupled from stateless allowed signatures where like I can make more signatures as long as I remember, like I can make 2 to the 10 without thinking about it.
Yeah.
But I can also make 2 to the 20 if I make sure I look at all my previous signatures.
Yeah, I mean, so one option is basically just do something like force itself. And force is a similar thing because force starts to degrade a bit once you start to like reuse number of signatures. So you can say, okay, we don't actually need the hypertree itself because we have a more conservative thing, and these signatures will be smaller because rather than because number one, you already need one of these for the sync signature in general, right? So you basically like, I'll cut off the tree and basically just do this instead of all the other stuff. So yeah, you're right. So if you make different assumptions around like is a million actually necessary? Is 100 million necessary? You definitely can get them smaller.
Yeah,
and it's just and it's interesting because if you look at the forum posts on the NIST website, basically it's like a Google Groups. Some people are saying, okay, well, should we actually give the users leeway around these parameter sets? Basically, isn't it better to basically have one parameter set and them not necessarily worrying about it? And the other thing is, well, if you look at like maybe it's here. Yeah, if you look at sort of the way these schemes are named, I think there's one where it has like a Q at the end, and that one has like less security basically. So they were worried, okay, well, how's the user going to know the difference between SLH DSA 128S and Q basically, right? So maybe there needs to be just some messaging around that, and would it be a different opcode? Would it be 2 opcodes? They're going to take a parameter, and then that determines if it's one of these sets basically. So it's kind of like a trade-off between sort of giving users customability for their use case versus just doing the most conservative thing. If you want the most conservative thing, you have a 50 kilobyte signature, and then you're done, right?
Because like in Lightning, which is the case where you probably want the most, you're already stateful. Like each time you're signing, you know what index you're at.
Yeah,
so
and like even on the commitment, we know what the actual commitment number actually is. Yes,
right. So it seems like you don't have that. You may need a lot, but you don't need a lot where you don't remember your previous ones, I guess, and that might be it.
And so the other thing is like XMS by itself, they're like stateful versions of this basically. So you can have a stateful version of basically just this where you're sort of remembering the signature count basically. And for example, in cases like Lightning, the signature count is actually already in the commit transaction. Right. So you can extract it, right? So as long as you have that, you can even see it on chain and then do something based off of that as well. So
okay, cool.
Question around if I wanted to do multisig with Sphinx.
Yeah.
I'm Binance. I don't want CZ just to be the only person holding the keys.
Yeah.
Is that well studied? Is it trivial? Is it needs a lot of work? Where are we at there?
Yeah, so that's definitely a drawback. Once again, because like it's just a hash function, there's no sort of like structure. For example, if you look at Multisig 2, the way it works, you can like look at the equations and like cancel things out, blah, 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 and it works basically because there's structure that's actually inherent there. This doesn't necessarily have that, right? So it would either be end signatures or feasibly a Stark proof of these parameters set that the end signatures were there, right? For example, imagine like I had a Merkle tree of like the end signatures basically, and then I prove, okay, well, this aggregated signature is one of n of these keys or 2 of n of these keys or whatever else. So it seems possible, but you don't necessarily have that structure there, right? And so maybe this is potentially one argument for something like the lattice-based cryptography, which, because there's more structure there, people can make more advanced schemes basically around, things that you would expect, public key derivation, adding signatures together, stuff like that, right? But if you wanted to go for the conservative, we already have hash functions, nothing else, this is what you get, but there definitely are trade-offs involved.
Actually, follow-up question on that. If you just do generic MPC on this type of scheme, with let's say you actually have to do all those hash functions in MPC. Has people done this?
Yeah,
it's feasible, right? Like I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, there was another hash pseudo hash-based scheme as part of like this competition called Picnic, basically. And Picnic is based off of just that, basically, right? And like it has like an MPC in the head component, which
without additional assumptions. Let's say like you have to do standard, generic MPC for Sphinx without Picnic.
that's possible. Like to me, like I feel like that's like Picnic, basically. If are you aware of the way Picnic works?
Yeah. But that's entirely different signature scheme, right?
But so you're saying you want to basically do like a shared MPC to jointly derive a signature.
Let's say we just standardize this one, and there's optical verified Sphinx, but there's no other signature. We picking this not in there, right? And then someone like Fireblocks has to go implement MPC for this.
Yeah, that seems possible in theory. I don't know exactly what right? Because would you need to actually invocate every single hash function call using the MPC? Exactly. Yeah.
Generically, yes.
Yeah. So what would be the speed of that, particularly when you're generating tens of millions, potentially hundreds of millions of hashes, for this? So it seems feasible, and maybe you're saying those that really need this, they can have some scheme, they can accelerate over else. But yeah, so I wouldn't rule it out. I'm just not sure exactly what some of the costs would be around like signature speed and such.
I think because for Starks and Picnic, I believe there's additional assumptions, right, over Sphinx.
You're right. Yeah, over Sphinx itself. Yeah, because Starks has the whole thing around like the threshold for sampling and stuff like that. Polynomials. Yeah.
So 2 questions left: Hunter and then Ava, and then we get lunch.
Hey, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
So, wow, really great presentation so far, by the way. Do you think that we should have like configure opcodes for like when you go to spend like in the script path spend, right? Like, do you think that we should have configurable SLH DSA opcodes? And another question I have.
What do you mean by configurable there?
Yeah, well, like just being able to provide these kind of parameters.
Okay, yeah.
Well, and then there's also another question I got is, because I got a lot of questions for you, buddy. Is, do you think that we like a naive implementation of Frost would be like, or Multisig too? Like, would they map onto this? Just because, like it basically be like a Merkle tree of hypertrees, and like. At which point, because SLX DSA doesn't support threshold signatures, right? So, like, you would probably need to map these other systems onto that. Except they also make use of like the linearity of signature, I'm probably really cringing out Peter Woolley here. So,
so to answer the first one, like as Clara was saying, maybe. Should there be 1 parameter? Should there be 3? Like, should you let a user put in like a bit string and parse out the parameters and then do like that? Probably not, right? Maybe you should have a few, right? Maybe that's the question. As far as like, can you do something like that? Like, not necessarily, right? I mean, so you could do something like I mentioned. You could just stack the signatures. I could have like a Merkle tree of the signatures and then require, okay, well, 2 of these are revealed, which are Sphinx signatures itself, but you don't have any of the structure, that you use for things like, key aggregation, Multisig 2, things like that. All that's gone because like, it's just a big hash tree. That's that, and which is what makes it simple as well too, right? Because you're just doing this hashing a bunch of times. You can check out the paper. Like, it actually has some pretty good pseudocode around the way you like generate this address, which is sort of like how you identify which leaf and then so forth, and you just repeat that all the way up, right? So there is that simplicity there because it's just a hash function, and that makes it simple. So you do trade off that for flexibility.
okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think Ava is saving her question for later, which means it's time for lunch.
Yeah.
Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.
Quick question. All right, how many people here know where the venue is? We have D, obviously Alex, myself. The venue's up the street, but if you want like help finding it, find one of us. Alex, you might have more comments about how to get there.
Yeah, if you go out this side of the building, take a left up the hill. It's at the top. You'll see it. It's the very imposing building. 2 cannons out front, Presidio Officers Club. Lunch is in the back, all the way back and up to the 3rd floor. You'll see it. We'll be there helping. If you do me a quick favor, if you guys have dishes that you use, please put them in the kitchen, preferably the dishwasher. Throw out any trash. That'd be amazing because we'll be back in here tomorrow. And you're looking at your cleanup crew right here. So thank you in advance for helping out.
Last thing is...